In this first video on women in the Old Testament, we begin by looking at the cultural backgrounds of ancient Israel and ways in which their lives and their laws were different than ours. Let's first consider how the life of ancient Israelite women might be different than a woman or girl living today in central New York, or rural Texas, or Mumbai, India. Each of these can bring up images and expectations about how women dress, what their homes might be like, and what a normal day might be like in their life. What do you think life was like for women in ancient Israel? We all read the Bible and listen to its stories through the lens of our own culture and experience. Carol Myers, a prominent archaeologist studying women in the ancient world in Israel, asks the students in her first class with her to write down their image of women in the Old Testament times. Here are some typical examples of what they wrote. Women were shrouded and quiet. I think of women as oppressed. Women were vastly inferior to men in biblical times. Subservience is what comes to mind. It's commonly thought that women's behavior was extremely limited, much as women are restricted in Saudi Arabia in modern times. Since only about 10% of the named people in the Old Testament are women, and few of them are headliners, we often have to look deeper into the biblical text and archaeological material to get a more accurate picture of the roles and the importance of women in ancient Israel. The Israelites, like the rest of the ancient world, were an agrarian society. About 90% were rural farmers, not city dwellers. The center of life and economy was the home. Unlike the industrialized world today, the Israelite household was the living space and the workplace for everyone in the family. There were no stay-at-home moms, except perhaps for some of the most elite. Households were generally composed of extended families. Therefore, the senior woman of the household functioned, as scholar Jack Goody calls, the chief operating officer. The Hebrew word for bread often means meal or food. And this makes sense because in ancient Israel, like most of the ancient Near East, 70 to 75% of their daily food came from grains, mostly wheat and barley. This had not changed much by the time Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." Growing crops, raising animals, and transforming these into food and other necessities was a group effort involving men, women, and children. Women had important economic roles with implications for social and religious life. Men and women working together were the breadwinners. It took 2 to 3 hours per day to make the daily bread for a family, and this was done primarily by the women. Archaeological evidence shows that often there was a shared community grinding stone where the women would work together, talk, and sing. Women often baked the bread in a shared clay oven. Both men and women could be shepherds, but women generally did the weaving and formed the fabric into clothing and other materials for the home and for sacred spaces. Within the economic household unit, women and men had to cooperate to meet the needs of the extended family and the community. By collaborating with each other, women formed a solidarity and a network. The structure of the community was forged by common need and daily contact. Women were also important in the production of essential elements for the maintenance of the tabernacle and the temple, and this must not be overlooked. The daily bread for the priests was provided by women. Weaving and sewing the sacred garments for the priests were also made by women. We recall Hannah bringing her son Samuel a new linen garment each year. That's in 1 Samuel 2. From our modern perspective, preparing bread and other foods for household festivities, producing sacred garments may seem like a trivial part of religious life. But studies of social and cultural customs show us that these women's participation in these roles for the sanctuary demonstrated expertise no less than the priestly duties. Carol Myers observes that late 20th century scholarship succeeded in establishing that women were not much more disadvantaged in their participation in communal religious activity than were non-priestly males. However, Inequities were present, which we will talk about also. The vital role of women in simply giving birth and raising children to adulthood also cannot be underestimated. Women were the primary caretakers of the family's health. Only about 1 in 2 children lived past the age of 5. Women were responsible for the management of the household and its inhabitants, from birthing, feeding, cleaning, and caregiving of the sick and injured. And not having children meant jeopardizing the viability of the family and even the community. Bearing children and rearing them to healthy, productive adulthood was essential for the survival of the household and also for providing care for aging adults. We need to rethink our ideas of patriarchy and matriarchy in the Old Testament. There is no word in Hebrew for matriarch or patriarch, only fathers and mothers and their descendants. In Genesis, wives were neither remembered nor portrayed as subservient to their husbands or to their fathers. They are portrayed as resourceful, independent, and hardly kowtowing to their mates. We'll see this in their upcoming stories in this course. But for now, let's look at the legal status of women in the Old Testament compared to the history of the legal status of women in the United States. Some of these will likely surprise you. Women, especially wives and girls, in ancient Israel overall had more legal rights than in much of U.S. history. In order to better understand some of the cultural differences between ancient Israel and the U.S., I'll begin with some information about marital laws and marital rights in the U.S. The control of women and girls in marital situations in ways we now recognize as demeaning and abusive have been legally sanctioned in the United States since until recent history. Here are 3 examples. The property rights of wives. In 1769, American colonies based their laws on English common law, which said, by marriage, the husband and the wife are one person in the law. The very being and legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated into that of her husband, under whose wing and protection she performs everything. By 1900, every state had passed legislation modeled after New York's Married Women's Property Act of 1848, granting married women some control over their property and earnings. But it was not until 1981 that the Supreme Court overturned state laws designating a husband the head and master, with unilateral control of property owned jointly with his wife. Marital rape is another topic. In the journal Criminal Defense Lawyer, Monica Steiner states, rape, any non-consensual sexual intercourse between non-spouses, has always been illegal. However, until 1975, every state had a marital exception that allowed a husband to rape his wife without fear of legal consequences. Gradually, from 1973 to 1999, all 50 states and D.C. had enacted laws against marital rape. The only marital exception that still exists in some states is for statutory rape. Child marriage, another important issue. The age of consent in American colonies was usually 10 to 12, as young as 7 years old in Delaware. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof reported that although our State Department protests child marriage in Africa and Asia, yet every state in America allowed child marriage until May 2018, when Delaware became the first state to ban all child marriages without exception. Previously, a child could be married with the approval of parents or a court, or when a girl is pregnant. Indeed, 20 states do not set any minimum statutory age for marriage, according to RIA Justice Center's Forced Marriage Initiative. So let's compare some of these laws in the U.S. and this history with some of the rights that women have in the Old Testament. Women's rights to make contract and purchase, own, and sell property. We give the example of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad that changed the laws of inheritance so that they could inherit their father's property. This is in Numbers 27 and Joshua 17. However, without special provision, inheritance generally did go to the sons. Another example is Job. Now, Job was an Edomite, not an Israelite, and he gave his daughters an inheritance among their brothers. That's in Job 42:15. In this story, only the daughters' names are given and not the sons. In Proverbs 31, a woman is commended for owning a house, buying and selling property, and conducting her own business. Another example is the married Shunammite during the time of Elisha. She owned a house, land, and fields. Injury of a pregnant woman by brawling men was to be compensated. She had a right to freedom from bodily harm. Women also had the capacity to appear and testify in court. Women would come to the court which was at the elders at the gate. That's in Deuteronomy 21. Also, both parents of a daughter would appear in court if a newly married man brought a legal claim that his wife was not a virgin, and the parents would be the one who would defend their daughter. Under David, the woman of Tekoa brought her case and petitioned for judicial action in 2 Samuel 14. And under Solomon, 2 prostitutes came to petition regarding the status of the remaining living child, and their case was heard. The Shunammite, also in the time of Elisha, appealed to the king for the return of her house and land after a famine, and her land was returned to her as her possession. Capital punishment for murder and laws for adultery applied equally to murder of a man or a woman. Yet, we also do read about many inequities in the treatment of women and girls in the Old Testament. The Bible is blunt and often brutally honest about the lives and behaviors of the people in it. But as a follower of Jesus, my hope for this course aligns with the teachings of the whole Bible. The New Testament gives us the perspective for reading and learning from the Old or First Covenant. For as Scripture says, all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Another passage states, "Now these things happened to them, the people of the Old Testament, as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." And another passage, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." And the Scriptures referred to there are the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Through the narratives, laws, and poetry, we are prompted to listen with a heart toward receiving instruction, correction, encouragement, and hope, to live our own lives with greater purpose, wisdom, and action that is rooted in love and justice and what is right.